Can I wash your bikes for a sandwich? Any Hell's Angels turned at once. And the parking lot went dead quiet. And Marcus Hawk Reynolds, 6'3" and covered in road dust, and he stared down at the boy 17, Annan, hollow-cheeked, and holding a dirty rag like it was the last thing he owned in this world. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Hawk said 4 words nobody expected. And first, you eat. If you've ever been so hungry, your pride felt like the only meal you had left, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow Ethan's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer Ethan Carter turned 17 was the summer he learned that the world does not slow down for grief. His mother, Sandra, had been sick since February, a condition that started as fatigue and became something the doctors used long words to describe, finished words that meant she couldn't stand at a cash register for 8 hours, and indeed couldn't wait tables. She didn't do any of the things she'd spent 20 years doing without complaint. And she was 41 years old, and she moved through the house like someone carrying invisible weight on both shoulders, trying to hide it from Ethan because she was his mother, and hiding pain from your children was something mothers did even when they shouldn't. His father, Dale Carter, left in March. And not dramatically. Not with a scene or a slammed door or even a real goodbye. He just stopped coming home one evening. And then 2 evenings became a week, and a week became a month. And somewhere in that stretch of silence, Ethan understood that his father had made a decision, and Ethan and Sandra were not part of it. And Dale left behind a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the kitchen counter, 3 months of unpaid utility bills, and a son who was going to have to figure out what came next. Ethan was the one who told his mother. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where she used to help him with homework, and he laid out the bills one by one like cards in a hand nobody wanted to be dealt. Electric, gas, and the landlord's notice, and the amount they owed on the truck that didn't run anymore. And Sandra stared at the numbers, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she didn't cry, because Sandra Carter was the kind of woman who did her crying in private so her son wouldn't carry it. Ethan, she said quietly, you don't have to. No, he said. I'm going to. And maybe that was the whole conversation. The next morning, he was up before dawn. In the town of Ridgecrest, New Mexico, sat in a bowl of red desert between 2 highways that most people used only to pass through. It had a gas station, a diner, a dollar store, a church, a bar, and the kind of slow and dry heat in summer that made every task feel twice as hard. Maybe 400 people who lived there full time, and most of them had been there long enough to know everyone else's business without being asked. Ethan had grown up in Ridgecrest. He knew which houses had dogs, which neighbors would give you a glass of water if you knocked, and which ones would pretend not to hear. He knew the diner opened at 5:30 in the morning, and that the owner, a compact woman named Peggy, kept a broom behind the counter and wasn't shy about using it if someone caused trouble. And also knew that there were no jobs. He had spent 3 months learning that the hard way. He went to the gas station first, they weren't hiring. He went to the dollar store, they weren't hiring. And he walked 2 miles down the highway to the truck stop. The manager there told him to come back when he was 18. He offered to mow lawns, and gutters, clean, haul brush, and fix fences. He made a sign out of cardboard and stood at the edge of the highway on 2 separate Saturdays. A man threw a half-eaten burger at him from a car window. A woman gave him $1 and told him to pray more. He didn't stop. Every morning he got up, ate whatever, was in the house, which was less and less as the weeks went on, and walked. Carried the rag with him. It had been his grandfather's, a man named Frank Carter, who spent 30 years as a motorcycle mechanic outside of Albuquerque before his hands gave out and he retired to a small house on the edge of Ridgecrest, where he taught Ethan, from the time the boy was 8 years old, everything there was to know about engines. Since Frank had died 2 years before, and the rag was one of the things Ethan kept. In it, not because it was valuable. Because his grandfather used to say, while wiping down an engine with that exact cloth, the way a man cares for a machine tells you everything about who he is. Anybody can tear something apart. It takes character to put it back together. Ethan kept the rag because it reminded him who he was supposed to be. It was the last Tuesday in July when he walked past the diner and stopped. He had passed Peggy's place 100 times. He knew the parking lot, knew the layout, knew the way the heat came off the asphalt in waves that made the air look liquid. But he had never seen the parking lot look like this. And there were motorcycles everywhere. Not 3 or 4. Not a dozen. Seemingly dozens upon dozens of them, arranged in loose rows that stretched from the front of the diner all the way to the far edge of the lot. Ain't big machines. Any road-worn machines. Machines that had clearly traveled hundreds, maybe thousands of miles, any chrome dulled with dust and road grime, and leather saddlebags cracked from sun exposure, any pipes still radiating heat from a long ride. And the men who owned them were standing around in clusters near the entrance, and some of them eating off paper plates someone had carried outside, and some of them talking, and some of them just standing in that particular way that large men stand when they're comfortable in a space and don't care who notices. Ethan counted without meaning to. 70, 80 more. He couldn't see all of them clearly, but the patches on their vests were visible even from across the lot. Hell's Angels. He had heard of them, them. Everyone had heard of them. In a town like Ridgecrest, the name carried the specific kind of weight that made people lower their voices. His mother had told him once, in the ways mothers tell their children things they hope they'll never need to remember, stay away. Inigo, don't make eye contact. Be polite if they talk to you, but don't go looking for conversation. Stood at the edge of the lot for almost a full minute. He thought about his mother at home, sitting in the chair by the window because standing hurt her back. He thought about the numbers on the kitchen table. He thought about the landlord's notice, which had a date on it, and that date was getting closer. And he looked down at the rag in his hand. And he walked across the parking lot. And he approached, was standing slightly apart from the others, the way that men who are in charge tend to stand, not because they move away from their group, but because space opens up around them naturally and they get used to it. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with gray threaded through dark hair, and a beard that said he'd stopped worrying about what it looked like a long time ago. Vest had more patches than most. His eyes, when they came to rest on Ethan, were the particular shade of brown that looks almost black in strong light. Ethan stopped 2 feet in front of him. His heart was doing something he could feel in his throat. "And sir," he said, but his voice didn't shake, which surprised him. "And I can see your bikes need cleaning. And I've got a rag and I know how to work. He won't miss a spot." He held up his grandfather's cloth. "Can I wash your bikes for a sandwich?" And the man's expression didn't change. And around them, conversation died. It didn't stop all at once. It tapered, the way sound does when people realize something is happening and they want to hear it. Ethan was aware, in his peripheral vision, of heads turning. The group reorienting itself unconsciously in his direction. And 50 people, and 60, maybe more, now looking at a 17-year-old boy standing in front of their leader with an old rag and no backup plan. And the man studied him for a long moment. And not the way people study something they're suspicious of. In the way they study something that doesn't fit the category they'd already prepared for it. And what's your name? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Ethan Carter. How old are you, Ethan Carter? 17. Another pause. You walked up to 90 Hell's Angels to ask for a sandwich. Yes, sir. And you know who we are. Yes, sir. And you still walked up. Ethan held his gaze. And I know how to clean a motorcycle. I'm not looking for charity. I'm offering a trade. And something shifted in the man's face. And not a smile exactly. Something quieter than a smile, but related to it. And Marcus Reynolds, he said. People call me Hawk. He didn't extend his hand yet. And before you touch a single bike, you're going to eat something. Because nobody makes a good deal when they're running on empty. He turned toward the diner entrance and raised his voice without effort. Bear, get this kid a plate. You don't need, Ethan started. Inigo, that wasn't a question. Any Hawk said, and there was no heat in it, and just a firmness that ended the sentence cleanly. A man appeared from inside the diner, big, wide-chested, with a gray ponytail and a beard that had probably started as a style choice and become a permanent feature of his face. He had the easy movement of someone who had been strong all his life and had learned to carry it lightly. He looked at Ethan with an expression that was somewhere between curious and amused. And you the kid who walked up and asked Hawk for a sandwich? Bear said. Offered to work for it, Ethan said carefully. And Bear looked at Hawk. And Hawk looked at Bear. And something passed between them that Ethan couldn't read. "I'm a plate," Hawk said again. "And already on it," Bear said, and disappeared back out inside. Gestured toward a section of the exterior wall where a few of the men were leaning, and Ethan followed him. He was aware that eyes were still on him, and he had become, without intending to, the most interesting thing in the parking lot. He kept his back straight. He kept his hands visible. He walked like a person who had somewhere to be, even though the truth was he had nowhere to be except here now, and trying not to let his legs show that they were tired. 'Cause they were. Been walking since 7 in the morning, and it was past noon, and the last thing he'd eaten was a bowl of cereal at breakfast, the last of the box, and he'd poured the milk out because there was barely enough to cover it, and it would be more useful for his mother to drink. And Hawk stopped by the wall and turned to face him. "And so," he said, "and tell me why." "Why what, sir?" "Why you walked up here instead of going somewhere else?" Ethan thought about it honestly, because the man in front of him seemed like someone who would notice if he wasn't honest. "And because there's nowhere else," he said. "I've tried everywhere in this town. I'm not too proud to work. And I'm not too proud to ask. But I'm not going to beg." He looked down at the rag in his hands, then back up. "And my grandfather taught me that if you offer something real, people will see it. In Ingsby, the work is real. I know how to do it right. Hawk nodded slowly, like someone receiving information he was filing away. "And your grandfather," he said. "A mechanic. Before he was retired. He worked on bikes most of his life, out of Albuquerque. He taught me everything he knew before he died." "And did he die?" "It's in 2 years ago. And the rag's his." Ethan looked down at it. "Yeah." Hawk was quiet for a moment. "And what's your situation at home?" Ethan didn't flinch. He had learned not to flinch when people asked, because flinching made them feel bad for asking. And then they stopped asking, and then you couldn't get any information through at all. "And my mother's sick. At work. My dad left in March. And the bills are behind. I've been trying to find work since April." He paused. "I'm still in school. I haven't dropped out, and I'm not going to." And that last part surprised even him. He hadn't planned to say it, but it came out like something he needed someone to know, as if saying it out loud made it more true. And Hawk's expression didn't shift into pity. And that was the thing that struck Ethan later when he thought about the conversation. Most adults, when he told them his situation, and shifted into a kind of careful softness in the same tone you use with someone who's just gotten bad news. And Hawk just listened, as if the information was data, as if he was making a calculation. And Bear came back out with a plate. And burger, fries, a cup of something cold. He handed it to Ethan without fanfare. Hawk said. Ethan hesitated. "I want to work first," he said. "And that's the deal I offered." Emir let out a short laugh, not unkind. More the laugh of a man who had just seen something he wasn't expecting. "Kid," Bear said. "And the deal is you eat first. The boss says eat first, you eat first. And that's not charity. That's the order of operations." "He's right," said another man who had drifted over younger than Hawk and Bear, with sleeve tattoos and an expression that seemed to be permanently set at slightly entertained. Stuck out his hand. "Annie, don't argue with Hawk about sequencing. And you won't win." Ethan looked at the plate. He looked at Hawk. And Hawk looked back at him with an expression that was patient in the way that a boulder is patient. It was going to be there whether you decided to move or not. Ethan sat down on a concrete barrier at the edge of the lot and started eating. He tried to eat slowly. He wasn't sure he succeeded. The burger was real, not fast food. The kind Peggy made from ground beef. She ordered from the butcher 2 towns over because she was particular about it. And the fries were thick and salted. And the drink was sweet tea, which hit the back of his throat in a way that made his eyes want to water, which he absolutely was not going to allow to happen. And while he ate, the bikers drifted. And not dramatically, and not all at once, but gradually. And the way a group of people shifts when there's something worth paying attention to. A few of them sat on the concrete barrier nearby. And a couple more leaned against the wall. And Bear sat on an overturned milk crate and crossed his arms and just looked at him. "So, your grandfather was a mechanic," Bear said. "Yeah." Ethan wiped his mouth. "And Frank Carter is..." He worked out of a shop in Albuquerque called Ridgeline Motors. "You heard of it?" "Any to go?" Bear's eyes moved. "Yeah, just a flicker." "Maybe," he said. "In what years?" "Started there in the late 80s. Went there until about 2015, when his hands got bad." Arthritis. In Ridge Line, Bear said mostly to himself. He looked at Hawk. The place on Central. And it ain't. I know it, said a man on the other side of Bear older, with a face like weathered leather and the kind of calm that comes from having seen a lot and decided most of it wasn't worth getting excited about. He was looking at Ethan with focused attention. Frank Carter. He had work done there once. Any long time ago. Ethan looked at him. And you remember him? I remember a mechanic who wouldn't let me leave until he'd run a full diagnostic, even though I just came in for a tire. And told me if he was going to put his name on the work, he was going to know what he was working on. The man made a sound that might have been a laugh and charged me 2 hours labor and saved me from a brake failure a week later. Yeah, I remember him. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He looked down at the rag in his lap. That sounds like him, he said quietly. And you know how to do more than clean? Hawk asked. He had moved closer while Ethan ate, and settling into a spot on the barrier a few feet away and not crowding him, and just present. My grandfather taught me basic repair. Any carburetors, any brake lines, sheet, chain maintenance, electrical basics. I'm not a full mechanic. I can do an honest job on most maintenance tasks. Ethan set down the last of the fries. And I can clean an engine the way it should be cleaned, not just the surface. And I know what's underneath. Show me, Hawk said simply. Ethan stood up. He looked out across the rows of motorcycles. Dozens of them, all road-worn, some worse than others. And which one do you want me to start with? And it Hawk pointed to his own bike. Not the most beat-up one. And the one that was clearly the most important. Walked to it. He crouched down beside it and looked at it the way his grandfather taught him to look at an engine, not hunting for problems, just listening. And the way you listen to a person before you start talking. He went to work. And the first thing he did was nothing that anyone watching would have called dramatic. Started at the top and moved methodically downward, which was the opposite of what most people did. And most people cleaned what they could see first. Ethan's grandfather had drilled into him that you start where the grime goes unnoticed, because that's where it does the most damage. He cleaned the head, gone. He cleaned around the cylinders. And he worked the rag into the gap between the engine and the frame, where oil mist accumulated over hundreds of miles and became a kind of dark paste that most people ignored, because you couldn't really see it without crouching. He moved to the primary chain cover, the battery box, the space behind the headlight housing, where dust packed into corners. He wasn't performing. He wasn't going fast to impress. He was just working. But people were watching. Bear had moved. He was now crouched a few feet away, his forearms on his knees, and watching Ethan's hands the way an expert watches an apprentice not to grade, but to understand. And you're going in order, Bear said. From the top. And gravity pulls the dirt down, Ethan said, not looking up. If you clean the bottom first and then the top, you're cleaning the bottom twice. And Baird didn't say anything. Ethan could feel the quality of his attention change. He moved to the chrome. His grandfather had taught him that chrome wasn't just aesthetic, it was a diagnostic surface. If you knew what to look for, and chrome told you where moisture was getting in, and where vibration was creating microfractures, and a bigo, where something was rubbing that shouldn't be rubbing. Ethan ran the rag slowly, eyes close, watching the surface the way a doctor watches a patient's face. He found a spot near the left exhaust bracket where there was a faint bluish discoloration in the chrome. He stopped. He, There's heat stress here, he said. Pinning on the bracket mounting point. It's minor, but it's recent. And someone might want to check the exhaust gasket on this side. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. And Bear stood up slowly. He moved to where Ethan was pointing and looked. "Hank," he said. And Hawk came over. He crouched. He looked at the spot Ethan was indicating. He said nothing for a long moment. And he looked at Ethan. "How old did you say you were?" "In 17. You know what you just found?" "My grandfather called it ghost bluing. It means the exhaust heat is transferring wrong. And it could be the gasket is starting to fail. Could be the bracket shifted. Either way, it's going to get worse before it gets better." And Hawk straightened up. He looked at Bear. "Pyre." "And yeah," Bear said quietly. "In snow." Ethan kept working. He moved from Hawk's bike to the one beside it, then the one beside that. He didn't ask permission. He offered to wash the bikes, and that's what he was doing. He had a system now, and the system had its own momentum. And some of the men moved with him. Not all 90, many of them were eating, talking, living their afternoon. But a cluster of 8 or 10 had formed around Ethan's progress, watching not with the attention you give to entertainment, but the attention you give to something you're trying to understand. A man named Joe, shorter than most, with quick eyes and an oil stain on his left hand that was probably permanent, fell into step beside him. "Your grandfather teach you to read chrome like that?" Joe said. "He taught me to pay attention," Ethan said. "And he said a machine team will tell you everything that's wrong with it if you know how to listen." "He trained anyone else?" Shook his head. "And just me. He didn't have the shop anymore by the time I was old enough to really learn. He just had the garage and the tools and a lot of time. He moved to the next bike. Spent weekends out there. He didn't think about it then as learning. And thought we were just spending time together." And Joe was quiet for a moment. "And that's how the good stuff gets passed down," he said. Not in a classroom. It was Bear who brought up Iron Valley. He had been talking to another, older rider for a few minutes off to the side, and then he came back and waited until Ethan had finished the current bike and stood up. "I want to ask you something," Bear said. "And you said you've been looking for work since April." "Yeah. You try Iron Valley Motors down in Castillo?" Shook his head. "And that's 20 miles from here." "You know what it is," Bear said. "Also a working shop. Any real work, not day labor. Old mechanic named Ray Donovan runs it. He's been looking for someone with real mechanical sense for about 6 months. Can't find the right fit." Ethan looked at him carefully. "Inshin, why you telling me this?" He shrugged with one shoulder, a gesture that said the answer was obvious, and he wasn't going to make it into a speech. "Because you know what ghost bluing is, and you taught yourself to diagnose it from an old man in a garage. And Donovan would know what to do with that." "I'm 17, Ethan said. "And I don't have a car." "And 20 miles is far," Bear agreed. "But it's not impossible." He tilted his head slightly. "And you said you're not looking for handouts. And I'm not offering one. I'm telling you a door you haven't knocked on yet. Ethan stood with the rag in his hand and looked down at it, thinking. He thought about the distance. He thought about the bus schedule, which he actually knew because he had memorized the county bus routes 3 months ago as a practical matter. He thought about whether a real shop would hire someone his age, without certifications, without a completed high school diploma yet. He thought about his grandfather, saying, "The door that's worth knocking on is usually the one that looks hardest to reach." "I'll go," he said. He had worked through 30 bike blocks by the time the afternoon reached the kind of heat that made the air feel solid. Arms ached. His knees ached from crouching. He had worked through the water bottle that someone had handed him, he didn't catch who, and was working on a second. His shirt was damp, and his hands had the particular kind of dirty clean that comes from working carefully with a rag, where the grime transfers away from the machine and onto you, which is exactly where it should go if you're doing it right. And then he heard the engine. It was different from the motorcycle's heavier world. The particular self-important sound of a large SUV moving through a space too small for it. He heard it before he saw it, registered it unconsciously, the way you register sounds that are out of place. He was crouched beside a bike near the outer edge of the lot when it happened. And the black SUV came in too fast, turned too wide, and the rear quarter panel caught the front fork of a motorcycle parked at the end of the nearest row. And the bike went over. It didn't fall dramatically. Toppled with the specific slow-motion certainty of something heavy that has lost its balance and naddlefence and cannot numb metal frame meeting the asphalt with a sound that the parking lot turned to hear. And the SUV stopped. Ethan was 5 feet away. He saw the window go down and saw the driver, a man in a collared shirt, 50-something, in the kind of face that was accustomed to looking at problems and calculating their cost, lean out and look at the motorcycle on the ground. And then the driver looked up. He looked at the people looking back at him. He looked at the patches on their vests. And he rolled the window up. An SUV started moving again. Ethan stood up. "Hey," he said. His voice was louder than he expected it to be. And the SUV didn't stop. "Hey," louder. Stepped into the lane the SUV was trying to use. "And you just knocked over a motorcycle." And the window came down again. And the man looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has decided they are dealing with an annoyance, not a problem. "Get out of the road, kid," the man said. His voice was the voice of someone who was used to sentences working the first time. "And you knocked over someone's motorcycle," Ethan said again. "And you need to stop." And the man looked past him. He was doing a calculation. Ethan could see it, the rapid cost-benefit assessment of someone used to making that kind of calculation. And something in the man's face settled. "He barely touched it," he said. "And then now move." "And you hit it at the front fork," Ethan said. "And I was standing right here. And I watched it happen." And the window started going up. And somewhere behind Ethan, a voice said, "Stop the vehicle." It wasn't loud. It was the opposite of loud. But it had the quality of something you didn't ignore. And just so, the window stopped. And Hawk was standing at the edge of the lane. And the man in the SUV stepped out because there was no good option that involved staying inside it. He was tall, well-dressed, in the specific way of someone who spent money on clothes without thinking about it. He looked at Hawk with the expression of a man who was recalculating very quickly. "Marcus Reynolds," Hawk said, and not an introduction. A fact. In Victor Hale, the man said, if his voice had changed, still controlled and still polished, but with something careful underneath it now. And I apologize for any inconvenience. I'll pay for whatever damage was done. And Hawk looked at the down bike and back at Hale. That's not the question, Hawk said quietly. The question is why you tried to leave. He was checking for damage, Hale said smoothly. He was going to pull around and come back. Ethan watched this. And he watched the way Hale's eyes moved across the crowd, cataloging the way you catalog options. He watched the way Hale had very carefully not looked at him. He saw it happen, Ethan said. His voice was steady. He was aware that it shouldn't be, aware that the situation had grown into something he had not anticipated when he walked across the parking lot 2 hours ago. His grandfather's words were in his chest like a compass needle. Truth is not valuable because it's easy. And truth is valuable because it costs something. Hale looked at him for the first time since stepping out of the vehicle. And the look was brief, assessing, and then it moved on the kind of dismissal that was meant to be felt rather than said. And the kid's confused, Hale said. He said it to Hawk, not to Ethan. As if Ethan were furniture that had developed an opinion. He barely grazed it. And the bike probably just tipped. It didn't tip, Ethan said. And your rear quarter panel caught the front fork. It was 5 feet away. And he heard it. I watched it happen. Hale's jaw tightened. And look, he said, and now the polish was starting to develop small cracks. And I said I'll pay for the damage. And that's fair. And he gone. But I'm not going to stand here while some homeless kid. He's not homeless, Bear said from somewhere to Ethan's left. His voice was completely flat. He's working. Deep. Hale stopped. Hawk was looking at him with an expression that had not changed since the window came down. Patient. Absolute. And you're going to stay, Hawk said. Until this is handled properly. And Victor Hale, who had money and a lawyer's number in his phone and connections in this county going back 15 years, and looked at the 90 Hells Angels standing in a diner parking lot in the New Mexico heat, and he stayed. Ethan stood in the afternoon sun with his grandfather's rag in his hand, his heart knocking against his ribs, and a feeling he hadn't felt in months, and that what he did mattered, and that the truth he told had weight. He didn't know yet what that truth was going to cost him. He would find out before the night was over. And Victor Hale didn't leave. And he didn't stop calculating either. Ethan could see it in the way the man stood weight, shifted to his back foot, hands loose at his sides, the posture of someone who had decided the current situation was temporary and was already working on what came after it. Hale was the kind of man who had spent decades turning bad moments into manageable ones, and right now he was doing exactly that, and running through angles, the way a chess player runs through positions, and looking for the move that cost him least. And what he hadn't accounted for was Ethan. And the boy was still standing in the lane with a rag in his hand. He hadn't moved since Hawk told Hale to stay. He hadn't performed outrage or tried to press his advantage. He just stood there, and the stillness of someone who had said the true thing and was prepared to keep saying, "Sation," it was the thing that seemed to bother Victor Hale most. "Look," Hale said, and his voice had found a new register, quieter, indeed more reasonable, in the voice of a man offering to be generous. He said, "I'll pay for the damage. Full replacement, not repair." It's more than fair. He looked at Hawk. I think we can all agree that's a reasonable resolution. What I saw isn't something money resolves, Hawk said. Hale's jaw tightened again. A small movement, almost invisible. He wasn't trying to leave the scene. He was pulling around to get out of the traffic lane. And there's no traffic, Bear said. His voice was still flat, the flatness of a man who was done entertaining alternatives. Hale looked at Bear, then at Hawk, then at the small cluster of men who had gathered in a loose arc without appearing to have organized themselves. He was doing the count. And 90 wasn't a number you argued with unless you had something equivalent. And what Victor Hale had was a cell phone, a good attorney, and the ability to make problems expensive for other people, none of which worked in a parking lot in real time. And all right, Hale said. Spread his hands slightly, a gesture of practiced reasonableness. I made an error in judgment. He'd panicked. He should have stopped immediately, and I didn't. And apologize. He looked at Hawk directly. Let me pay for the bike. Let me make this right. And Hawk looked at the motorcycle on the ground. And Tom, the man who owned it, a quiet and thick-armed rider named Kellerman, who hadn't said more than 10 words since the incident, was crouched beside its knee, running his hands along the frame in the specific way you assess something you built yourself. And Tom, Hawk said. And Tom stood up slowly. And he wasn't visibly angry. And that was somehow worse than anger. The fork's bent, Tom said. And the lower leg. It didn't crack, but it's going to have to come off. He paused. And this bike is 15 years old. And you've had this fork since I built it. And you can't just order a replacement and call it equivalent. Hale opened his mouth. Don't, Bear said. And something in the word stopped Hale as cleanly as a closed door. And there was a long pause. And Hale looked at Ethan. Indirectly, this time. And through him, not past him. And the look lasted only 2 or 3 seconds. But Ethan felt the weight of it, the particular Ethan might see someone who had decided you were going to be a problem. And you, Hale said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. And you said you saw everything. He did, Ethan said. And you were working. And cleaning bikes. The words carried a faint edge of something not quite contempt, but adjacent to it. And you're what, 16? And 17. And you live here in Ridgecrest? Yeah. Hale nodded slowly, the nod of someone absorbing information and categorizing it. And you know who I am. And you said Victor Hale, Ethan said. That's my name. And do you know what I do? Ethan looked at him steadily. No, I manage commercial property in this county, Hale said. I have been for 20 years. You know this town, and I know most of the people in it, and I know the families. He let that sit for a moment. I'm sure you're a good kid. I'm sure you're trying to help. But you were 50 feet away, and it happened fast, and memory is a funny thing. Isn't it possible you're not exactly sure what you saw? And the parking lot went quiet in a different way than had been quiet before. And this was the quiet of people watching someone try to do something. Ethan was aware of every eye on him. He was aware that Hale was doing something sophisticated, not threatening him, not bribing him, and just introducing doubt into the air around him, in the way you introduce a small amount of something corrosive and let it do its work. He was also aware that his grandfather had talked about this exact thing. And not in those words. But he talked about a time when he was young and he'd witnessed something he shouldn't have, and someone with money and a lawyer had tried to convince him that his recollection was unreliable. His grandfather had said, "The moment you start wondering if you really saw what you saw, you've already lost yourself." It was 5 feet away, Ethan said. It's not 50. He was crouched beside the last bike in that row when you came through. And I heard your engine, and I stood up. Saw your rear quarter panel contact the fork. I watched the bike go over. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't add anything to it. He just said it. And not confused about what I saw. Hale studied him for another moment. And something in his expression closed, like a window going shut. Fine, he said. He looked back at Hawk. And tell me what the repair costs, and I'll write a check right now. And that's not how this ends, Hawk said. And how does it end? With you going nowhere until we've done this properly. Hale took a breath. And you're talking about a police report. And that's what people do, Hawk said, when property gets damaged and someone tries to leave. And for a long moment, nobody moved. And Hale reached into his jacket pocket for his phone. The deputy who arrived was a young man named Cortez, maybe 25, with the careful professionalism of someone who hadn't been doing the job long enough to get careless about it. Afisa took in the scene, the downed bike and the black SUV, the parking lot full of Hell's Angels, and the 17-year-old standing in the middle of all of it without any visible change of expression, which Ethan noted and respected. Cortez spoke with Hawk first, and with Hale, then with... He came to Ethan, stepping slightly aside so they could talk without the others directly in earshot. And you said you witnessed the incident, Cortez said. He had a notepad out, the old-fashioned kind. Yes, sir. Encino walked me through it. Ethan did. He said it the same way he'd said it to Hale, because it was the truth, and the truth didn't need different versions. He described his position, and described the sound of the engine, and described standing up and watching the SUV's rear end swing out, and described the moment of contact, and described the bike going over, and described the window coming down and Hale looking out. He looked at the bike, Ethan said. He looked at the group. And then he put the window up and started moving. And Cortez wrote without looking up. And Ed, you're certain about the sequence? Yeah. You said you were working out here. Cleaning on us, cleaning bikes. Yes, sir. And you work for this group? No. Ethan hesitated for just a moment. They came here looking for work. They gave me a meal and let me clean their bikes in exchange. And Cortez looked up at that. Pen stopped. He looked at Ethan, then at the rows of cleaned motorcycles, then at Hawk, standing 20 feet away. And all right, Cortez said. And he wrote something, so. In your full name and contact. Ethan gave it to him. After Cortez moved back to speak with Hale again, and Hawk appeared at Ethan's shoulder and hurried, as if he just happened to end up standing there. Did good, Hawk said quietly. He just said what happened, Ethan said. And what doing good looks like, most of the time, Hawk said. Hale gave his statement, wrote a number on a card that he handed to Cortez for the insurance documentation, and then went through the motions of cooperation with the exact quality of a man performing cooperation while his mind was elsewhere. When Cortez was done with him, Hale walked back to his SUV and stopped, stood with his hand on the door handle, and looked across the lot at Ethan. It wasn't a threat. It was more unsettling than a threat. It was the look of a man who had filed something away. And I'll remember this, Hale said. Into the group, not to Ethan specifically. And he got in and drove out of the lot and was gone. And Bear was at Ethan's side almost before the SUV had cleared the entrance. And you know who that is, he said. And he not alarmed. And more like someone checking what a person knows before deciding how much to say. And he said he manages commercial property in the county, Ethan said. He nodded. And that's one way to put it. Mr. Hale has his name on about 40% of the commercial leases between here and Castillo. In offices, shops, industrial space, he paused. And some residential. Ethan felt something cold touch the back of his mind. And residential. Yeah. How much residential? I don't know the exact number, Bear said. He's a significant landlord in this part of the county. It's been for a long time. He looked at Ethan. And you rent. Ethan thought about the landlord's notice on the kitchen table. And he thought about the company name printed at the top of it, not a person's name, a company name, the kind of name that could belong to anyone. He had seen it so many times in the last month that he'd stopped really reading it. And what's the name of his company? Ethan asked. Hill Property Group, Bear said. Though sometimes it goes by HPG Land Management. Different names, same ownership. Ethan was quiet for a moment. PG, he said. He said it slowly, like he was hearing a song he recognized but couldn't place. And he placed it. HPG Land Management. And that was the name on the notice. And that was the name on every piece of correspondence about the rental. Had been for the 3 years they'd lived in the house, so long that Ethan had stopped seeing it as a name and just seen it as a watermark. And Victor Hale's company was their landlord. And the man he had just given a sworn statement against was the man who held the lease on the only roof over his mother's head. He didn't say anything to Bear about the connection right away. He needed a moment to let it settle, to figure out if it was as bad as it felt, and the feeling it gave him was not good. It was the feeling of standing on ground that seemed solid a second ago and is now telling you something different through the soles of your feet. He kept working. There were still bikes to clean, and he had made a deal, and Ethan Carter was not going to walk away from a deal because things got complicated. He moved to the next motorcycle and got back down on his knees and used the rag and tried to think clearly. And the math was not hard. And Victor Hale was a man who, by his own description, had been managing property in this county for 20 years. He had connections. And he had lawyers. He had the kind of influence that didn't need to raise its voice because it worked through paperwork and deadlines and clauses in lease agreements. Ethan had just stood in a parking lot in front of a deputy sheriff and told the exact truth about what the man had done. And there were 3 possible outcomes he could see from where he was crouching. And one, Hale would shake it off and pay what he owed and move on to more important problems. The rich men had a lot of problems. A teenager in a biker parking lot might not even make the list. And 2, Hale would make a quiet phone call to someone at the property management office and flag the Carter lease for review. Legal, clean. Nothing you could point to. And Ethan was overthinking this, and the whole thing would dissolve in 24 hours like most problems did. He knew which one felt most likely. And he also knew it didn't change anything. It was Danny who found him still working when most of the afternoon had burned down to early evening and the heat had finally started to give a little. And he crouched beside him, forearms on his knees, the same way Bear had earlier. And he had a bottle of water, and he set it next to Ethan without commentary. And you've been quiet, Danny said. I'm working, Ethan said. And as you were already quiet before. After Hale left, Danny tilted his head slightly. He said something to you, specifically. He said he'd remember this, Ethan said. Yeah, he said it loud enough that a few of us heard. Danny paused. And you know what that means, or you don't. Ethan sat back on his heels. He looked at the bike in front of him, at the cleaned chrome catching the late light. Company is my family's landlord, he said. And Danny didn't react dramatically. He absorbed it the way someone absorbs information they've learned to process without letting it move their face. How far behind are you? He said. Wasn't gentle the way people were sometimes gentle when they thought gentleness was a kindness. Was direct. Before 3 months on rent, Ethan said. And we've been making partial payments. In the notice they sent, he stopped. And started again. We have maybe 6 weeks before it becomes a legal action. And he was quiet for a moment. And he said, you told the truth anyway. Yes, Ethan said. And knowing this, didn't know it until after Bear told me the name, Ethan said. But it wouldn't have changed what I said. And Danny looked at him for a long moment. And he stood up and walked back toward the group without another word. Ethan watched him go and tried to read what it meant and couldn't. Picked up the rag and went back to work. And Bear came back as the last of the light was going orange. And he sat on the barrier near where Ethan was finishing the last row of bikes, and he had 2 cups of coffee, both of which he set down, and for a while he just let the silence run. And tell me about your grandfather, Bear said finally. Ethan looked up. He hadn't expected that. And why? Because you've been working for 4 hours and you haven't complained once, and you found a mechanical fault on Hawk's bike that our regular shop missed last service. And because you've got that rag in your pocket, like it's something you'd run back into a burning house for. Bear looked at him steadily. And so tell me about him. Ethan picked up one of the cups of coffee. He held it with both hands and looked at the steam. His name was Frank, he said. Francis Earl Carter. He grew up in Tucson and learned mechanics from his own father, who worked on farm equipment. He moved to Albuquerque in his 20s and opened a shop with 2 other guys and eventually bought them both out. He paused. He was fair. He was the kind of mechanic where the people who came in became regulars, not because of price, but because they trusted him. He never told someone a repair was needed if it wasn't. Never. And he taught you, Bear said. And from the time I was maybe 8. Weekends mostly. He'd have something up on the lift and he'd just start talking about it and I'd listen. He was a good talker when he was talking about machines. And quiet otherwise. Ethan looked at the rag. When he died, I kept the rag because it still smelled like his shop. Like grease and metal and that particular kind of cleaner he used. He was quiet for a moment. Doesn't smell like that anymore. But I still know what it is. And he nodded slowly, the nod of someone who understands exactly what a person means. Hey, Donovan, Bear said. I want to tell you something about him before you go see him. Ethan looked at him. And Ray worked with a mechanic in Albuquerque in the mid-90s. About 2 years, maybe 3. He's mentioned that man's name to me more than once over the years, because he says those 2 years were the ones where he learned what kind of mechanic he actually wanted to be. Bear picked up his coffee. The man's name was Frank Carter. Ethan didn't move. And your grandfather trained Ray Donovan, Bear said. And the weight of that took a moment to land. Ain't just the fact of it, but the shape of it, the way a kindness given in 1995 had traveled forward through decades and was now sitting in a parking lot in New Mexico in the form of a door that might still be open for a boy who needed one. He never told me about a Ray, Ethan said quietly. Maybe he didn't know where Ray ended up. Maybe he didn't think to mention every apprentice. Bear shrugged. Maybe some things work the way they're supposed to work without needing to be explained. Ethan looked down at the rag. He thought about his grandfather's hands, the arthritis that took them in the end, the way he would flex his fingers, sometimes on cold mornings like he was trying to remember what they'd once been able to do. He thought about everything those hands had passed on. And does Ray know about my grandfather? Ethan said. And that he passed? You don't know what Ray knows, Bear said. And that's part of what you'd be telling him. And Hawk came over when Ethan was done with the last bike. And the parking lot was quieter. Now some of the riders had gone inside, and some had drifted to their bikes, and the evening was settling in with the particular quality of a summer night in the desert, and where the temperature drops faster than you expect, and the air changes texture. And you finished every bike, Hawk said. He said it the way, just say something you already know, because you want to acknowledge that you know it. Yeah, Ethan said. And Hawk looked out at the rows of machines. Clean, not surface clean, actually clean, the kind of clean that showed someone had cared. And Tom's bike, Hawk said. And the one Hale knocked over. And you were the first person over there. It was already close, Ethan said. You tried to help him write it before you even thought about whether it was your place to. Hawk looked at him. Most people think about their place first. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. And Hawk nodded once, the nod of a man who has reached a decision through a process that didn't require more words. And Bear told you about Ray Donovan, Hawk said. Yeah, go see him. And this week, not next week. Hawk reached into the inside pocket of his vest and came out with a card, not a business card, just a card, with a phone number written in the quick handwriting of a man who didn't spend a lot of time on presentation. And that's Ray's number. And you call him, you tell him Hawk sent you. He'll see you. Ethan took the card. And Ethan. Hawk's voice didn't change register, but Ethan heard the shift in it anyway. The shift from one kind of serious to another. Hale is going to be a problem. Maybe a small one, maybe not. But I want you to understand something. Okay, Ethan said. And what you did today, standing up, staying with your account, not moving off of it, that's not nothing. That means something to the people who were watching. And the people who were watching aren't going to forget it. Hawk looked at him steadily. You understand what I'm saying? I think so, Ethan said. And you're not standing alone in this, Hawk said. That's what I'm saying. Ethan held the card in his hand and felt something he hadn't felt in months. And not safety. The situation was not safe, and they both knew it. Not confidence exactly either. And something that sat between those two things. And the feeling of being seen by someone who knew what they were looking at. Thank you, he said. And he meant it in a way that was too large for the two words, but he used them anyway because they were what he had. Hawk looked at him for one more moment, and he said, "Get home to your mother." Ethan walked home. And wine. 20 minutes through the cooling desert evening, the card in his right pocket and the rag in his left, and his arms aching in the specific way they ached when he'd done real work. He went through what had happened in order, the way his grandfather had taught him to think through a problem, not jumping to the end, starting from the beginning and working forward. He had walked into a parking lot with nothing. He had come out with a lead on a real job, the name of a mechanic who had learned from his grandfather, and a statement on record with a county deputy. He had also come out with Victor Hale's attention. When he got home, his mother was in the kitchen, which was better than the chair. And she had made something from what was left in the refrigerator. He didn't ask what, because it didn't matter. She had made something, and that meant she was having a good enough evening to stand, and good evenings were worth protecting. She looked at him when he came in, at his dirty shirt, at the rag hanging from his pocket, at the particular quality of tired on his face, that she knew the difference between the tired of discouragement and the tired of actual work. "And you found something," she said. "I might have," he said. He sat down at the kitchen table, put the card down in front of him and looked at it. And he looked up at her. "Mom, what's the name on the landlord's notice? The company name?" And she looked at him. Small change in her expression, careful. The way you get careful when a question has a particular tone. "HPG Land Management," she said. He nodded. "And why?" she said. "And you know who owns it?" And she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, because she had learned to sit down when her son got a certain expression on his face. "And the name at the top of the envelope when we signed the lease," she said slowly. "Hale, Victor Hale." Ethan was quiet. "Ethan," she said, and her voice had a new note in it. "And what happened today?" "Today." He looked at her. And he thought about how much to say and how to say it, and whether protecting her from information was a kindness or a disservice or a disgay. He had watched Victor Hale look at him in that parking lot and file him away. And his mother deserved to know what was filed. "I need to tell you about today," he said. "And all of it. And I need you to hear it without worrying about me, because I made the right calls, and I'm not going to change my mind about any of it." And Sandra Carter looked at her son across the kitchen table in the failing light. And she folded her hands in front of her on the table, her mother's hands, and she nodded once. "And tell me," she said. "See," so he did. Started at the beginning, and he didn't leave anything out. Not the diner. It could be, and not Hawk, and not the food he'd eaten, and not the bikes he'd cleaned, and not what he'd found on Hawk's engine, not Bear, and the information about Ray Donovan, and not the moment the SUV came through the lot, not what he'd said to Cortez, not the way Hale had looked at him when he left, and not Bear's revelation about the company name, and not what Hawk had said to him at the end. He told her all of it. When he finished, Sandra was quiet for a long time. And long enough that the kitchen had gone dark around them, and neither of them had moved to turn on the light. "He's going to come after the lease," she said finally. And he shied, not a question. And the statement of a woman who had lived long enough to know how certain men operated. "Maybe," Ethan said. Maybe he's got too much going on to bother with us. Maybe you, but and you knew that was possible when you stood up and told the deputy what you saw." He found out about the connection after, he said. "And Xion, but it wouldn't have changed it." And she looked at him for a long moment. and he couldn't fully see her face in the dark. But he knew the expression anyway. He had memorized his mother's face at every angle and in every light a long time ago. And your grandfather would have done the same thing, she said quietly. I know, Ethan said. And she reached across the table and put her hand over his. We deal with what comes, she said. And together. Outside, the desert was dark, and the stars had come out in the specific way they came out in Ridgecrest, and without competition from city light and filling the sky from edge to edge. Ethan looked at the card on the table. And Ray Donovan's number. A door his grandfather had built 30 years ago, still holding on its hinges. He was going to knock on it in the morning. And whatever came after that, he was going to face it with the same thing he'd walked into the parking lot with the truth in his hands and nothing to apologize for. But the night was not done with him yet. At 11:15, his mother's phone rang. And she looked at the screen. And at you, her face changed. And she turned it so Ethan could see the number. End known caller. But below it, the voicemail notification that appeared after it rang twice and stopped. And she put it on speaker, and they listened to it together. And the voice was calm. Professional. Angie, the voice of someone who made calls like this routinely, because it was a routine part of their job. This message is for Sandra Carter. This is a notice from HPG Land Management regarding your tenancy at 412 Mesquite Road, Ridgecrest, New Mexico. And we are initiating a formal lease review due to sustained payment deficiencies and potential lease violations. And please contact our office within 48 hours. And failure to respond may result in acceleration of eviction proceedings. Thank you. And the recording ended. And the kitchen was completely silent. Ethan looked at his mother. And she looked back at him. And her hands were still folded on the table. And they weren't shaking. And Sandra Carter did not shake. But her face had the look of someone absorbing a blow they had been bracing for, confirming the thing they hoped would not come. 48 hours. And Victor Hale had not waited until morning. Ethan called the number at the next morning. Not because he expected anyone to answer at 7 in the morning. Because he needed to do something with his hands that wasn't sitting still, and calling the number was the first thing on the list of things that needed doing, so he did it. It rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail that told him he had reached HPG Land Management and that office hours were 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. He hung up and looked at his mother. And Sandra had not slept well. You could tell not from her face, but she had trained her face to fill for that, but from the way she moved through the kitchen, with the slight deliberateness of someone compensating for a body that didn't have its full reserves. She was making coffee. She had her hands around the pot, like the warmth of it was doing something useful. 9 o'clock, he said. Office opens at 9. And I heard, she said. And she poured the coffee. And she set a cup in front of him. I want to say something before this day starts. Okay. Whatever happens with the house, she said, I need you to know that I don't regret what you did yesterday. And not one piece of it. She sat down across from him and held her own cup with both hands the way she always did. And you told the truth. That's not something you ever apologize for. No, he said. I'm not sure you completely believe that yet, she said. Induced. The expression you've been wearing since 11:15 last night. He looked at her. And she looked back at him with the particular patience of a mother who had watched her son's face for 17 years and could read it the way most people read large print text. "And I believe it," he said. He just also believed that believing the right thing doesn't automatically protect you from the consequences of it. So, and Sandra nodded slowly. "And that's a very grown-up thing to understand. And Grandpa taught me," Ethan said. "He said truth is valuable because it costs something. And didn't say it was free." She was quiet for a moment. "And he denied." Outside the window, the morning was coming up hot already, the kind of early July heat that didn't bother to wait. She said, "Call Ray Donovan, too." And this morning, this, he looked at her. "And that feels like the wrong priority right now." "It's the right priority," she said firmly. "And deal with the house. And you deal with your future. And both things at the same time. And that's what adults do." She picked up her coffee. "And your grandfather didn't stop working when things got hard. And neither do we." At 9 o'clock exactly, he called HPG Land Management. And the woman who answered, had the voice of someone reading from a script. Not because she was reading from a script, but because she had said the same thing so many times that spontaneity had worn out of her responses. "I'm calling about the voicemail we received last night," Ethan said. "In 412 Mesquite Road. Shh. In Sandra Carter's lease." Pause, the sound of typing. "And you are Ethan Carter, Ethan." And her son, more typing. "And then I see the account. And there's a review initiated on that property. Someone from our management office will be reaching out to the account holder directly." The voicemail said 48 hours, Ethan said. "And what specifically triggered the review?" Another pause. Andy, longer this time. In the pause of someone checking whether they were permitted to answer that question. "And I'm not able to discuss account specifics with a non-account holder," the woman said. "Mrs. Carter will need to contact us directly." And she's going to. But I want to understand what we're responding to." "And sir, I'm not." "Is this review connected to an incident that happened yesterday at Peggy's Diner on Route 9? Silence, not the silence of someone thinking. In the silence of someone who has been asked a question they weren't expecting and is recalibrating. And not able to comment on. "And that's enough of an answer," Ethan said quietly. And he hung up, but sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. And he called Ray Donovan. Ray Donovan answered on the second ring, which told Ethan the man was already awake and working, which told him something useful about the man before they'd spoken a word. "And Donovan," the voice said. Indirect, not unfriendly, just economical. "Mr. Donovan, my name is Ethan Carter. And Hawk Reynolds gave me your number. He said to tell you he sent me." A brief pause. "And Hawk sent you?" "Yes, sir." "And how old are you?" "And 17. A longer pause. "And what do you do?" "And I can clean an engine the right way. He found ghost bluing on Hawk's exhaust bracket yesterday that his regular shop missed. And my grandfather trained me. And his name was Frank Carter. He worked out of Ridgeline Motors in Albuquerque from the late 80s to about 2015. And this pause was different from the others. It had a quality to it, not computation, but something more personal. Something that took a moment to surface. "And Frank Carter," Ray said. His voice had changed register, dropped into something quieter. "NT, Frank Carter was your grandfather." "Yes, sir." "And Frank," he stopped and started again. "And when did he pass?" "And 2 years ago." And arthritis took his hands first. His heart went after. And Ray was quiet for a long enough moment that Ethan thought the connection might have dropped. Ethan, he was the best mechanic I ever worked beside. Not the fastest, and not the loudest. The best. Another pause. "And you have his hands." Ethan looked at his hands, still slightly rough from yesterday's work. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "And I'm still learning what they can do." "Come in Thursday," Ray said. 8 in the morning. "And bring whatever tools you have. And I'll tell you in an hour whether you've got his hands or not." "You don't have a vehicle," Ethan said. "I'm in Ridgecrest. He can get the county bus too." "I'll have someone pick you up," Ray said. 7:15. Outside, he paused. "And Ethan, and your grandfather, I owe him more than I've ever been able to pay back. So you come in and you show me what you've got. That's all I'm asking." And the line went quiet. Ethan held the phone and looked at the kitchen wall and thought about his grandfather at his workbench in the garage, hands moving through an engine the way a musician moves through familiar chords, and felt something complicated and warm move through his chest. He didn't have time to sit with it. His mother's phone rang. It was a different number this time. Not the HPG general line. A direct line. And when Sandra answered and put it on speaker, the voice on the other end was not the scripted woman from earlier. "Mrs. Carter," smooth, and male. A voice that had learned to be pleasant the way some people learn a second language competently, without accent, but without the unconscious ease of a native speaker. "And my name is Gerald Pitts. I'm a senior manager with HPG Land Management. I'm calling to discuss your tenancy at 412 Mesquite Road." "I'm listening," Sandra said. And she sat very straight. "Mrs. Carter, I'll be direct with you. And your account shows a significant payment deficiency, 3 months of partial payments against a full monthly obligation, with the arrears now totaling just under $4,000, a pause precisely calculated to let that number land. Under the terms of your lease, this constitutes grounds for termination proceedings." "I'm aware of the arrears," Sandra said. "And we've been making consistent payments. And we haven't abandoned the lease. Just partial payments are still a breach of the lease terms," Pitts said gently. "And however, I'm calling because Mr. Hill has personally reviewed this account, and he's interested in finding a resolution that works for everyone." Ethan felt the words land in his chest like something cold. "And kind of resolution," Sandra said. And her voice was flat and careful. "And there are a couple of options on the table. And the first is a payment plan that would bring the account current over 60 days, with a good faith payment of $2,000 made within the next 72 hours. He paused. "And the second option, and this is something Mr. Hill wanted me to convey personally, involves a simpler path forward. We understand that your son was a witness in an involving Mr. Hale yesterday. A written statement was given to the county sheriff's office. If that statement were to be amended, or if your son were to communicate to the responding deputy that he's had time to reconsider his recollection, Mr. Hill is prepared to waive the outstanding arrears entirely. And the account would be cleared. No further action on the lease. And Sandra did not speak immediately. Ethan was watching her face, and her face did not move. "Let me understand you correctly," Sandra said finally. "Mr. Hale wants my 17-year-old son to change a truthful statement he gave to a police officer. And in exchange for that, he'll forgive what we owe him." He wouldn't characterize it that. "It would," Sandra said. "And that's what you just described." Another pause. And Pitts spoke again. The pleasantness had thinned slightly, like paint over metal when the weather gets in. "Mrs. Carter, I want to make sure you understand the alternative here. And without a good faith payment of $2,000 within 72 hours, we would be within our rights to pursue formal eviction proceedings. And given your payment history, a court would likely." "Thank you for calling," Sandra said. "He'll be in touch with your office." And she ended the call. The kitchen was very quiet. And Sandra put both hands flat on the table and looked at Ethan with an expression he had seen on her face only a few times in his life, the expression she wore when something had made her genuinely bone-deep angry. And she was containing it carefully, because containing it was the more effective response. "And we are not changing your statement," she said. "No," Ethan said. "And I want to be clear that this is my decision as much as yours. It came after me to get to you. It tells me everything I need to know about who Victor Hale is. And Mom grew up in a house where my father did whatever people told him to do because he was afraid of what happened if he didn't." Her voice was controlled and low and completely steady. "He spent 30 years trying to be different from that. We are not folding on this." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. "I'm calling Hawk," he said. "Answer Hawk on the third ring." Ethan told him about both calls. And he told him about Pitts, and about the offer, and about the 72 hours, and about the $2,000. He kept it short because the facts were short, and adding to them would just be noise. And he finished. There was a brief silence on the other end. "He moved fast," Hawk said. "It wasn't surprise. It was assessment." "Yeah, you haven't changed your statement." "No, you're not going to." "No," Ethan said. Another pause. "And your mother?" "And same." Okay, the word was simple, but it had the quality of something being resolved. "And don't call Pitts back. And don't call the HPG office. Ain't call Hale. And don't talk to anyone from his organization without telling me first." A pause. "I'm going to make a call." "And Hawk, I'm not asking you to." "You didn't ask," Hawk said. "I'm telling you what's going to happen." And the line went quiet. Ethan set the phone down. He looked at his mother. And she looked back at him. "Indy, what did he say?" she asked. "He said he's going to make a call." And she considered that. "And do you know what that means?" "No," Ethan said. And he said it like he knew. And by noon, things had begun to move in ways Ethan couldn't fully track. And Bear showed up at the house at 11:30. He knocked on the door with the unhurried knock of a man who has been to a lot of doors in his life and doesn't feel any particular urgency about whether they open quickly. Ethan opened it. Bear was standing on the step with two large paper bags and an expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "And a Hawk sent me," Bear said. And it's also I brought food because it seemed like a practical move. Ethan looked at the bags. Air, he said. We can't. But it's groceries, Bear said. And not charity. And Hawk's calling in advance on your consulting fee for the diagnostic work you did yesterday. He held the bags out. And you found a fault our regular shop missed. And that has a dollar value. And take the bags. And behind Ethan, Sandra appeared. She looked at Bear, at the bags, at her son's face. And come in, she said simply. And this Bear came in. He set the bags on the counter and didn't make a production of it. He shook Sandra's hand, sat at the kitchen table when she gestured to it, and he accepted coffee because she offered it. And refusing offered coffee was a way of telling someone their hospitality wasn't worth accepting, which Bear clearly had no interest in communicating. Hawk talked to someone this morning, Bear said. He held the coffee cup and kept his voice level, factual. A woman named Diane Cho. She's an attorney in Castillo. And she handles tenant rights cases, among other things. And Hawk has used her in the past for various matters. And he's familiar with HPG land management. And Sandra's hands went still around her cup. And familiar how, Ethan said. And familiar in the sense that she's handled 3 previous cases involving tenants who pushed back against HPG on lease disputes. And you see, 2 of those cases settled in the tenant's favor. And to court and HPG lost. Bear looked at Sandra directly. And what they did last night, calling at 11:15, the offer to waive arrears in exchange for a statement change, Diane says that crosses lines. And potentially several of them. And you mean legally, Sandra said. You mean the offer to trade a lease concession for a change to a witness statement given to law enforcement. Not a gray area. And that's witness tampering, potentially. Or at minimum, obstruction. Bear set down his cup. And Diane wants to talk to you both. And today, if possible. And Sandra and Ethan looked at each other. And we can't pay an attorney, Ethan said. And Hawk's covering the consult, Bear said. And Diane is taking this on contingency if it goes further, which means she gets paid when she wins, not before. He looked at Ethan. And she also wants the phone that received the voicemail. And she's going to want a full account from you of what Pitts said on the call this morning. And Sandra has the voicemail, Ethan said. And we didn't delete it. Good, don't. And Shidi Sonda. Sandra looked at Bear with the expression of a woman who was trying to understand what kind of thing was happening to her and whether it was safe to let it. He is Hawk doing this, she said. And we're nobody to him. And my son cleaned some bikes yesterday. And Bear was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be considering how to answer that honestly. Eck has been in situations where he had nothing. And someone decided that made him a target, he said. Not exactly the same situation, but the same principle that people without money or connections can be pushed around because there's no cost to pushing them. He looked at her steadily. Ethan stood up yesterday and told the truth when it was easier not to. And that's not nothing, and that's not a small thing, he paused. And Victor Hale made the mistake of thinking that because Ethan has nothing, nobody around him has anything either. And Sandra looked at him for a long moment. And she nodded once, the nod of a woman making a decision that she was going to hold to. And tell us where to meet Diane, she said. Diane Cho's office was 22 miles from Ridgecrest, in a building above a dry goods store in downtown Castillo that had the particular atmosphere of a space that worked hard and didn't waste money on appearances. The walls had diplomas and case citations and a whiteboard that looked like it was in permanent use. Anne herself was 40-something, compact, with dark hair pinned back, and the focused energy of someone who was always doing three things at once and considered that efficient rather than stressful. Nick Bear drove them. He sat in the waiting area outside while Diane met with Sandra and Ethan because he had the particular tact of a man who knew when his job was to transport people and when it was to stay out of the way. And Diane listened without interrupting. She had a legal pad, and she used it. But she wrote in shorthand that Ethan couldn't read, and she never took her eyes off whoever was speaking for longer than a second. Sandra played the voicemail through her phone's speaker. Diane's expression didn't change, but her pen moved faster. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we have." In the voicemail from 11:15 p.m. In the same evening as the incident is an obviously toxic connection in time. The Pitts called this morning with the explicit offer to waive arrears in exchange for a statement change is the more significant document. And you have the audio of the voicemail. And do you have any record of the Pitts call? Came to my phone, Sandra said. I don't know if it recorded. We'll check. If it didn't record, your accounts plus the timestamps of the call in your phone log still establish a pattern. Diane set down her pen. Victor Hale made a stupid mistake this morning, or rather his manager made one on his behalf. And the offer was too explicit. He should have come at this sideways, a quiet pressure on the lease, without any direct connection to the statement. But he moved too fast and too directly, and that's going to cost him. Can you actually stop the eviction? Ethan asked. He can file for an emergency stay on the eviction proceedings, while the question of retaliation is investigated, Diane said. And that freezes the clock. It won't be instant, but it will be faster than HPG's timeline. She looked at him. And the more important thing is this: if what Pitt said on that call can be established, and I believe it can, then what Hale did is not just a civil matter. Attempting to use a private financial arrangement to influence a witness in a law enforcement matter is a criminal issue. I'm going to be making a call this afternoon to the county sheriff's office. Ethan sat with that for a moment. And Deputy Cortez. Do you have his name? Good. I'll start there. She picked up her pen again. I also want to be honest with you both. And this is going to take some time. And Victor Hale has resources, and he has people who know how to slow things down. What I can do is make it expensive and public for him to continue. And men like Hale generally don't want public. She looked at Sandra. Can you make the next scheduled payment on your lease? If I had it, Sandra said quietly. How much is the monthly payment? Ain't $9.50. And Diane nodded. And she made a note. I'm going to make a call about that too, she said. And there are emergency tenant assistance funds in this county. And you'd qualify. It won't cover the arrears, but it will cover the current month, which is what we need to keep you in compliance while the stay is in place. And Sandra looked at Diane for a long moment. And the expression had the look of someone who has been underwater for a long time and has just surfaced and isn't quite sure the air is real. We haven't asked for help from anyone in a long time, Sandra said. No, Diane said, and said it without condescension. But Hale came after your son to get to you. Hence, you're allowed to push back with whatever tools are available. We're back in Ridgecrest by 3 in the afternoon. And dropped them at the house and said, Hawk, would be in touch. And he said it in the matter-of-fact way of a man for whom this kind of thing was simply what you did, not anything requiring acknowledgement. Ethan watched him drive away and stood on the front step for a moment in the heat. Phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. He answered it. Ethan Carter. The voice was male, middle-aged, carrying the specific flatness of controlled anger. And not Pitts. Not anyone from HPG. And someone different. Speaking, Ethan said carefully. "Your name doesn't matter," the man said. "I am going to say one thing. And Victor Hale is a patient man. He's been patient with tenants before. He's been patient with employees before. He's been patient with people who created problems for him before." A pause. He's not going to keep being patient with a teenage boy who doesn't know what he walked into. Ethan's hand tightened on the phone, and he kept his voice level. "And then Mr. Hale should have driven more carefully yesterday," Ethan said. He paused, then the line went dead. Ethan went inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He thought about calling Hawk, and then thought about what Hawk had told him. Don't contact anyone from Hale's organization. But this wasn't from Hale's organization, or at least it wasn't anyone he could identify. He wrote down the number, took a photograph of it on his phone, and he called Diane Ann. She answered in 2 rings. "Just got a call," Ethan said. And he read the number. "Say exactly what was said," Diane told him. He did. There was a pause on her end, the pause of someone reclassifying a situation. "And don't respond to that number," she said. "And send me the screenshot." "And Ethan, this is actually useful. This means Hale is rattled. Patient men don't make calls like that before lunch." "It wasn't him directly," Ethan said. "It doesn't matter. And the number will trace. And a threat, even an implicit one, is a different category of problem and financial squeeze." She paused again. "And I'm moving the filing up. And today." And by 4:30, the filing was done. And Diane sent a confirmation message to Sandra's phone. "Emergency stay. Application submitted to the county court. HPG notified. Eviction proceedings formally suspended, pending investigation into alleged witness retaliation and tenant harassment." And Sandra read the message 3 times. She didn't cry. And that wasn't Sandra Carter's way. And she sat with the phone in her hand and breathed slowly and let the thing that had been coiled in her chest since 11:15 the previous night begin, cautiously, to loosen. "Now what?" Ethan said. "And now we wait," she said. "And now you go do your homework, because you told me you weren't dropping out, and that means you still have a paper due Friday." He looked at her. "Mom, Ethan." Her voice was firm and warm at the same time, the exact combination that only mothers managed well. "And you fought today." "So did I, and Diane is fighting. And apparently 90 Hell's Angels and their attorneys are fighting." She set the phone down. "And there's nothing more to do tonight. See, so go do your homework." Almost smiled. "Not quite." But close. And he went to his room. He got out his books. He sat down at his desk and tried to do homework and managed about 40% of the required concentration, which was better than he expected. 6:15, Hawk called. And Diane filed, Hawk said. He wasn't asking. "Yeah, she told us this afternoon." "Good. She's the best in the county." Gail knows her name, and he doesn't like hearing it. Hawk paused. And there's something else. Okay, that number that called you this afternoon. In the threatening call. Ethan sat up. And you know about that? And Diane called me, Hawk said. And the number traces to a man named Curtis Webb. And Webb does contract work for a property investment group that Hale uses for, let's say, informal negotiations. A pause. And Webb has a history. He's not a nice person. He called a 17-year-old to deliver a threat, Ethan said. He did, Hawk said. Which is a mistake. Because now his name is attached to this situation in writing. Hawk's voice was completely even. It wants you to understand something, Ethan. Gail has escalated this twice in under 24 hours. And first the lease, then Webb. Men who escalate that fast are men who feel their control slipping. Expected you to fold last night. And you didn't. He expected you to fold this morning. And you didn't. A pause. He's going to try one more time. Ethan's stomach tightened. And how? I don't know exactly, Hawk said. And then it will be more direct than a phone call. And be careful. And I need you to do something. And what? Tomorrow morning, before school, I need you to go to the sheriff's office in Castillo and give a follow-up statement. And tell Deputy Cortez about Webb's call. In person. And on record, Hawk paused. And don't let any of this stay verbal. Everything on record. Everything documented. And that's how you fight people who use systems. You use the same system back. I'll go in the morning, Ethan said. Good. Another pause. And Bear tells me you have a meeting with Ray Thursday. 7:15 pickup, Ethan said. And good, Hawk said again. And then get some sleep. And you're going to need it. And the call ended. Ethan sat in his room in the dark with his homework open on the desk in front of him and thought about the last 30 hours. He thought about the rag in his pocket when he walked across the parking lot. He thought about Hawk saying, "First, you eat." He thought about Bear in the kitchen that morning, setting down grocery bags like it was the most ordinary thing. He thought about Diane's pen moving across the legal pad, about Deputy Cortez's careful face, about his mother's hands flat on the table saying, "We are not folding on this." He thought about his grandfather, who spent 2 years teaching a young mechanic named Ray Donovan how to really work, and never told his grandson about it, as his grandfather was the kind of man who didn't catalog his generosities. He thought about Curtis Webb's flat, threatening voice. He thought about the way Victor Hale had looked at him when he left the parking lot. And filed away. Patient, not patient enough, Diane had said. Picked up his pen and went back to the paper. He had school tomorrow. A sheriff's office visit. And Thursday, he had the most important job interview of his life for a chance his dead grandfather had built without knowing it would ever come to this. He was not going to waste any of it. At 9:45, there was a sound outside the house. Not loud, a vehicle moving slowly on the road in front, stopping, moving again. Ethan went to the window. In the low light, he could make out a truck parked on the far side of the road. And not a vehicle he recognized. Idled for about 30 seconds. And it moved on. Then, he watched it go. Stood at the window for another 2 minutes to make sure it didn't come back. And he went to his mother's room and knocked softly. "Hey, Mom, I need you to lock your window tonight." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. He went back to his room. If he didn't sleep for a long time. 2 in the morning, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. And just 4 words. Last chance. He's smart. He photographed the screen. He sent it to Diane. He sent it to Hawk. He set the phone face down on the desk and lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling and breathed. He was scared. He was not going to pretend otherwise, not to himself, because pretending you aren't afraid was the kind of performance that left you blind to real danger. He was scared and he was tired, and his mother was in the next room, and the house they lived in was in the hands of a man who had decided in the space of less than 24 hours that a 17-year-old with a cleaning rag was worth pursuing. And that meant something. He turned it over in his mind and found the thing that it meant. It meant Victor Hale was more afraid than he was, nay, afraid of the statement. Afraid of what it cost him if it stood. Afraid, possibly, of what else might come out if an attorney started pulling on threads. A man who was comfortable and secure did not move this fast. And a man who had nothing to hide did not call at 11:15 at night. A man whose record was clean did not send Curtis Webb to call teenagers with 4-word threats before the sun came up. Hill was running. He was just running toward Ethan rather than away from him because he had miscalculated which direction was safer. Ethan stared at the ceiling. He thought about his grandfather's rag, which was still in his jacket pocket on the chair by the desk. He thought about what it had gotten him in the last 30 hours: a meal, a job lead, a connection to a mechanic who owed Frank Carter more than he'd ever repaid, an attorney, a filing, and the focused loyalty of people who had no obligation to him at all. A dirty piece of cloth and the willingness to offer honest work. He thought about Thursday and about Ray Donovan and about what his grandfather's hands might have passed through 30 years of weekends into his own. He thought about what Hawk said one more time. Hill was going to make one more move. And the question wasn't whether. And the question was when. And the answer, Ethan understood as he finally felt sleep coming, was going to arrive before Thursday. He was at the sheriff's office in Castillo by 8 in the morning. Deputy Cortez was already at his desk, which told Ethan the same thing Ray Donovan, answering on the second ring, had told him, that this was a man who started his day before most people thought to. And then Cortez looked up when Ethan came in, and his expression did the small shift of someone who recognizes a face and is recalibrating context. "Ethan Carter," Cortez said. "You need to add to my statement from yesterday," Ethan said. "And I have some things you should see." He sat down across from Cortez and put his phone on the desk. He showed him the screenshot of the 2:15 a.m. text. He showed him the log of the unknown call from the previous afternoon. He told him, word for word, as best he could reconstruct it, what the man calling himself nobody had said. And Cortez wrote everything down in the same careful way he'd written everything the first time, without editorializing, without visible reaction. Ethan finished. Cortez looked at his notes for a moment. "And the number from the afternoon call," he said. "And you said your attorney traced it to a Curtis Webb." "That's what she told me." "And Diane Cho in Castillo." She said Webb does contract work for property investment groups connected to Victor Hale." And Cortez nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone running something against what they already know. "I'm familiar with Webb," he said finally. Inshu not elaborating, just acknowledging. Is that good or bad? Ethan said. And Cortez looked at him. It means you're not the first person to write down his number. He picked up the phone on his desk. Ain't here. Ethan waited. Boof. He sat in the hard chair across from Cortez's desk and listened to the sounds of a working sheriff's office, printers, voices, a radio somewhere running through a scan cycle. He thought about his mother at home. And he thought about the truck that had idled outside their house. He thought about the text arriving at 2 a.m. with the particular coldness of someone who wanted you to know they were awake and watching while you were trying to sleep. And Cortez came back 15 minutes later. He sat down and looked at Ethan directly. "I've escalated this," he said. And the combination of the HPG call, which your attorney has already flagged to our office, and Webb's contact and the text constitute a pattern. I'm not going to tell you exactly what happens next because I don't want to say something I can't guarantee. But I want you to know it's being looked at by people above my pay grade. He paused. And you did the right thing coming in. My attorney told me to, Ethan said. And your attorney is smart, Cortez said. In addition, so are you for listening. He handed Ethan a card different from the standard business card, a direct line written in pen below the printed number. Anything else comes in. Anything. You call that number. Ethan took the card. And he had two now. Any Hawks and Cortez's. And he thought about what it meant that a 17-year-old from a forgotten desert town had acquired in the space of 48 hours, a biker who watched his back and a law enforcement officer who wrote down his personal line. And he thought about his grandfather's rag and the chain of things that had followed from one small act of honest work. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. And ahead. And do you think he's going to back down? And Cortez was quiet for a moment. And not the quiet of evasion, but the quiet of a man, giving a serious question the weight it deserved. And like hail, Cortez said, usually down when the cost of continuing outweighs the cost of what they're protecting. And right now he's trying to figure out which way that math runs. He looked at Ethan steadily. What you control is making sure the cost of continuing keeps going up. Ethan nodded, stood and shook Cortez's hand. He had school in 40 minutes. And he walked out into the morning heat and caught the county bus and sat in the back and looked out the window at the desert going by and felt underneath the exhaustion and the fear and the low constant hum of uncertainty, something that surprised him. And he felt clear. Wednesday passed in the specific way that days pass when something large is pending slowly at the surface and very fast underneath. Ethan went to school and did the things you did at school and spoke when spoken to and handed in his paper on time. Phone didn't ring. And no unknown numbers. No texts. Diane sent a message at noon. HPG had acknowledged receipt of the stay filing. And no response yet from the court, but the timeline was working. Any Hawk called at 5. Any Webb's been picked up, Hawk said. And not with satisfaction. And just information. Sat up straight. And what? Sheriff's office. They moved fast once Cortez escalated it. Webb has outstanding warrants from another county, nothing to do with you, but it means he was already a known quantity, and your documentation gave them a reason to move on him today rather than whenever. A pause. It also means Hale just lost the person he was using to apply informal pressure. And will that slow him down? In for a day or two, Hawk said. Maybe more. Depends on whether he has someone else to use and whether he thinks using them is worth it at this point. Another pause. And Diane is filing a civil harassment complaint tomorrow in conjunction with the tenant retaliation claim. She's building a case, not just a defense. Changes the math for Hale. Ethan let that settle. And what does that mean practically? It means instead of you and your mother defending against him, he starts having to defend against you. Hawk's voice was even, factual. He came at a kid with an old rag who had nothing. It ends up with a sheriff's action, a tenant rights attorney, an emergency stay, and a harassment filing. A pause that had something in it Ethan couldn't quite name. Miscalculated badly. He thought I had no one, Ethan said. Yeah, Hawk said. He was wrong about that. And Thursday morning came the way important mornings come ordinary on the surface, weighted underneath. Ethan was outside at 7:10, 5 minutes early, with his grandfather's tools in a canvas bag his grandfather had used for 30 years. And the bag was worn at the handles, and one of the buckles had been replaced with a different style that didn't quite match, and it smelled like oil and metal, and the particular accumulated history of a working life. And he had cleaned the tools the night before. And not because they were dirty, he kept them clean, but because cleaning them was the thing he did when he needed his hands occupied and his mind to settle. And the truck that pulled up at 7:15 was an older Ford, the kind of truck that looked like it worked for a living. And the man driving it was young, maybe 22, with the easy manner of someone who had been sent to do a simple thing and intended to do it simply. And you, Ethan, the driver said. Yeah, Ray sent me. And I'm Marco. Get in. The drive to Castillo was 20 miles, and Marco made it in comfortable silence, which Ethan appreciated. He was thinking about his grandfather. He was thinking about what Ray Donovan had said. On the phone, you have his hands. I'll tell you in an hour. He was thinking about what it meant to be tested by a man who had learned from Frank Carter. He would know it's probably better than anyone living, and what Frank Carter's teaching looked like in the hands of someone who had received it. Iron Valley Motors was a real shop. And that was the first thing Ethan registered, not from what it looked like, but from what it sounded like and smelled like. And the particular combination of air compressors and metal and lubricant, and the low persistent smell of heated rubber that meant the shop had been running long enough to absorb itself into the walls. It was busy without being chaotic. In 3 bays, 2 other mechanics visible, both working without looking up. Ray Donovan came out from the back. He was 60 or close to it, medium height, with the kind of build that said he had been strong in a working way his whole life rather than a deliberate way. His hair was gray and short, and his hands, Ethan noticed the hands immediately. It was the first thing his grandfather had taught him to notice about a mechanic were the hands of a man who had used them every day for 40 years, and scarred and calloused and stained in the permanent way that meant the work had become part of the skin. Stopped in front of Ethan and looked at him. Not up and down, not appraising. He looked at Ethan's face the way someone looks when they're searching for a resemblance. And you've got his eyes, Ray said. It's Frank's eyes. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Taught you from what age? Ray said. Moving on, the insticle. 8, 9. Until he was about 70 and his hands got bad. And what was the first real repair he let you do alone? Carburetor rebuild on a 78 Sportster, Ethan said. He watched but didn't touch. He was 12. He nodded. And did he say when you were done? Ethan almost smiled at the memory. He said, it'll run. Now take it apart again and do it faster. And Ray made a sound that was a real laugh, short and genuine. That's Frank, he said. And God, that's exactly Frank. He shook his head once, and for a moment the 60-year-old mechanic had something young in his face, the expression of someone who just heard a voice from a long time ago. Past 2 years back, you said. And see, 2 years in April. Into, Ray nodded slowly. He should have found him. He thought about it more than once. If moves. He said it, the way people say things they have made peace with, but haven't completely forgiven themselves for. And he straightened. Then all right. And you said you found ghost bluing on Hawk's exhaust bracket. And he walked me through how you found it. Ethan walked him through it. He described his starting point, his method, and the surface reading, and the specific quality of discoloration he'd noticed and why it indicated heat transfer rather than simple grime. He used the words his grandfather had given him, the vocabulary of a man who had worked on engines for 50 years and distilled that experience into language a boy could carry. Ray listened without interrupting. Ethan finished. Ray said, what would you have done about it? And check the gasket first. If the gasket's intact, check the bracket mounting torque. It might have vibrated loose over miles, which would create micro-movement and heat transfer to the chrome. The torque's within spec. Check the exhaust flange for warping. And Ray looked at him for a moment. In that order, Ethan confirmed. In cheapest and simplest first. Frank's rule, Ray said quietly. In Frank's rule, Ethan agreed. And Ray looked at the canvas bag. And those his tools. And some of them. Into the ones that fit my hands. And put them down and come with me. And the hour Ray had mentioned stretched to 2 hours, then 3, because neither of them was watching the clock. He gave Ethan a task and watched him do it, and then gave him another. Each one slightly more complex than the last. Each one calibrated to tell him something specific about the boy in front of him actually knew versus what he thought he knew. Ethan made 2 mistakes, caught one of them himself before Ray said anything, and explained the second one accurately when Ray asked what had gone wrong. And you know when you don't know, Ray said after the second one. And my grandfather said that was the most important thing, Ethan said. In knowing the edges of what you know. It is, Ray said. It's also the thing most young mechanics can't do. And fill in what they don't know with confidence, and then you find it when something breaks. He wiped his hands on a cloth and looked at Ethan steadily. And you have his hands, and not as trained yet, but the same quality of attention. Ethan felt something move in his chest, kept his face level. I want to offer you a position, Ray said, and to start after school and Saturdays. Honest wage, not apprentice rate, because apprentice rate is an excuse to underpay people who are actually working. And we'll see where it goes. He paused. And the one condition is you finish school. And non-negotiable. Frank Carter would come back from the dead and haunt my shop if I let his grandson drop out. And I wasn't going to drop out, Ethan said. And good, then we don't have a problem. Ray held out his hand. Ethan shook it. It was a firm handshake, and the kind that means what it says. And Ethan held it for the right amount of time and let go. And when he did, he felt something click into place in his life, like a component that had been waiting for its correct position. And there's something else, Ethan said. He felt he owed Ray the context. And there's a situation with our landlord, a man named Victor Hale. He was a witness against him 2 days ago, and he's been applying pressure since. And there's legal action going. And I wanted you to know, in case it becomes complicated. And Ray's expression didn't change. And Victor Hale, he said, and not a question. And you know him? Know of him, Ray said. Tried to buy this building 3 years ago. And he wanted to develop the lot. He told him it wasn't for sale. A pause. And he found 3 different code violations in the next 6 months and reported all of them to the county. 2 were legitimate, 1 wasn't. And it took me 8 months to clear it. He looked at Ethan. And so yes, I know who Victor Hale is. And that doesn't change the offer. Ray looked at him with an expression that was as close to offended as his steady face got. And Frank Carter's grandson comes to my shop and stands up straight and shakes my hand and tells me the truth about a hard situation he's in. He picked up his cloth and turned back to the work. And the offer stands. And to see you Saturday. And Marco drove him back to Ridgecrest. And Ethan walked in the front door at 2 in the afternoon, and his mother was sitting at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand and an expression he couldn't immediately read. And what happened? He said. And she looked up. And then she did something she almost never did. She smiled a real one, not the careful kind she used when she was managing him, but the kind that came from somewhere genuine and surprised her on the way out. And Diane called, she said. And the court granted the stay. And the eviction proceedings are suspended pending investigation. She set the phone down. And HPG filed a response this morning. And either withdrawing the lease review. Ethan stood very still. And they withdrew it, he said. Completely. Diane thinks Webb being picked up yesterday spooked them. It established that the pressure campaign was coordinated and documented. And that's the kind of thing that turns a landlord dispute into a criminal investigation. Sandra shook her head slightly. Ill calculated that you'd fold. And you didn't. He applied more pressure. And when that was documented, and when his contractor got picked up, the cost-benefit flipped. She paused. And Diane's words were, he blinked. Ethan sat down across from her, put his hands flat on the table the way she had done 2 days ago. And we still owe $4,000 in arrears, he said. And Diane's working on the tenant assistance funds for the current month, Sandra said. And she said the harassment failing gives us grounds to petition for a reduction in the arrears based on the demonstrated retaliation. It's not guaranteed, but it's a real argument. She looked at him. And what happened at Ray's? He told her. And he told her about the 2 hours of tests, about the mistakes he'd made and caught, about what Ray had said about Frank Carter's hands. He told her about Saturday. He told her Ray's wage offer. And he saw something happen in his mother's face when he said the number, not relief. Something more complex than relief. The expression of someone who has been holding enormous weight for a long time and has just had a portion of it acknowledged. And Saturday, she said. And after school on weekdays when there's work. And she reached across the table and put her hand over his. And your grandfather would be. She stopped. And started again. Pretend to be matter of fact about it, she said. He'd say something like, well, of course, the boy has good hands, but he'd be so proud he wouldn't know what to do with it. Ethan looked at their joined hands on the table. His mother's worn and honest. His own still faintly stained from Ray's shop. He know he said. And their Hawk called at 4. And I heard about the stay, Hawk said. And the withdrawal, Gafoot. And Deanne called you? And she didn't have to. Have other ways of knowing things. A pause that carried a trace of something like satisfaction. And did well. You didn't do anything except tell the truth and then document everything, Ethan said. That is doing something, Hawk said. And as most people stop at the first part. And they tell the truth and then they go home and wait and hope it's enough. And you kept building. And you showed up at Cortez's office. And you called Diane with every contact. And you gave Ray the full picture when you didn't have to, a pause. And that's not nothing, And that's how you fight something bigger than you. You don't let anything stay informal. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Is it over? Probably, Hawk said. And men like Hale don't keep fighting expensive battles once the leverage is gone. He's lost Webb. He's got a harassment and a sheriff's investigation, and his retaliatory eviction is now a matter of court record. And there's nothing left for him in this. A pause. That you stay sharp. And if anything comes from his direction, anything you call Cortez first and me second. And Cortez first, Ethan said. Got it, how was Ray? Hawk said. And the shift in his voice was deliberate a man, consciously moving to something better. He said, I have Frank's hands, Ethan said. And the pause that followed was brief but real. Yeah, Hawk said. And I figured he'd say that. Another pause, shorter. And Saturday's your first day? Yeah, good, Hawk said. The word landed the way it had been landing all week, simple and complete, and meaning more than its syllable count suggested. After the call, Ethan sat in his room. He took his grandfather's rag out of his jacket pocket and held it in both hands. It was grayer than it had been at the start of the week, ground in from 3 days of work and worry and the specific kind of handling that happens when a thing becomes an object of thought rather than just use. He thought about the morning he'd walked into that parking lot with nothing, with a rag and a question and the decision to offer something real instead of asking for something free. He thought about what that one moment had set in motion. 80 bikers. A meal he'd had to be ordered to eat. An attorney he couldn't afford. A deputy who'd written down his direct line. A mechanic, 60 years old, who looked at his hands and saw his grandfather in them. A mother across the hall who said we don't fold on this and meant it with everything she had. Bill had thought he was alone. He had been wrong in a way so it was complete it almost instructive. Ethan set the rag on the desk beside Ray's card and Cortez's card and Hawk's card. And 3 cards in 2 days. A rag that still held the shape of his grandfather's grip. Picked up his homework. He was not done yet. And not with the week, not with the fight, not with the long work of becoming whatever he was going to become. And the ground beneath him was holding, and that was enough for tonight. Outside, the desert was cooling toward evening, and the sky was doing the thing it did in New Mexico in July, turning colors that didn't have names in the ordinary vocabulary, in deep orange, fading into something close to purple, and stars beginning to assert themselves at the edges. Ethan Carter, into 17, skinny, blonde and tired, and not at all finished, opened his notebook and got back to work. And Saturday came without ceremony, which was the right way for it to come. Ethan was outside at 7:10 again, and the canvas bag over his shoulder, and the rag in his jacket pocket, where it always was now, and less out of habit and more out of something he couldn't fully name the way people carry objects that have become part of how they understand themselves. And Marco pulled up in the same Ford at 7:15 exactly. And the drive to Castillo was quiet, the way the first one had been, and Ethan spent it the way he'd spent the first one, looking out at the desert and thinking about what his hands were going to be asked to do. And Ray had a transmission job waiting. And not a warm-up task. It's not something designed to ease a new person in. A real job, a 2003 pickup, with a manual transmission that had developed a grinding shift and a clutch that was slipping at the top of its engagement range, and a customer who needed the truck back by Monday because it was a work vehicle and Monday was a Monday. In he go, Ray walked Ethan through the job in 4 sentences, pointed at the lift, and went back to what he was doing. Ethan put the truck on the lift. He got under it, started at the beginning, and worked forward into the way his grandfather had taught him, and which was the way Ray had been taught, and which was the way knowledge travels when the people carrying it take it seriously. Hour in, Marco appeared at the edge of the bay and crouched down to look at where Ethan was working. And Ray doesn't give the transmission jobs to new people, Marco said. Ethan didn't look up from what he was doing. He give new people any oil changes, and filter replacements, and stuff where they can't do serious damage. He gave me a transmission. Yeah, Marco said. He noticed. Ethan came out from under the truck and stood up. He looked at Marco. Is that your way of telling me something? And Marco shrugged with one shoulder. It's my way of telling you that Ray made up his mind about you before you walked in the door Thursday. And the 2 hours of testing was formality. He pushed off the doorframe. He told me Wednesday night that Frank Carter's grandson was coming in and that he hoped the kid had his grandfather's hands. He paused. And he said it like it was already true. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the truck on the lift. And I better not drop the transmission, he said. And Marco laughed a real one and went back to his own bay. He didn't drop it. And the job took him 4 hours, which was an hour longer than it should have taken a trained mechanic, which was exactly the right amount of time for someone who was 17 and had learned from a garage and a weekend education and 40 years of a dead man's wisdom. And Ray came by twice not to check on him, or not only to check on him, but to look at the work, the way you look at work that you're genuinely curious about. He didn't say anything either time. He just looked and moved on, which Ethan understood, because his grandfather had done the same thing. And he'd learned that silence from Ray's direction meant the work was saying what it needed to say. When he was done, Ray came and put the truck through its test cycle in the parking lot and came back in and set the keys on the workbench. And clean, Ray said. In 2 letters. Ethan felt them land like a complete sentence. Cut the engagement a little short on the clutch adjustment, Ethan said. And he wasn't sure if the owner liked a high or low bite point, and I didn't have a preference on file, so I went middle. And Ray looked at him. And you know you can call the customer and ask. No. I didn't want to seem like I didn't know what I was doing. That's backward, Ray said, not unkindly. And the customer to ask their preference on clutch feel is knowing what you're doing. Tells them you understand that the truck is theirs, not yours. He leaned on the workbench. And Frank used to say, the machine belongs to the person who drives it. And your job is to make it behave for them, not for you. Ethan looked at the keys on the bench. He said almost exactly that. He said everything exactly, Ray said. He spent 2 years writing things down after he said them. He straightened. And go get lunch. And you've got a break job this afternoon. Ethan went and got lunch from the place across the street that Marco had pointed him toward, a counter spot that countered sandwiches and knew the Iron Valley crew by name. He sat at the counter and ate and thought about how 2 weeks ago he had eaten a burger in a biker parking lot because a man named Hawk had refused to let him work on an empty stomach, and how that meal had been the hinge point on which everything else had turned. He thought about the landlord's notice on the kitchen table. And the arrears were still real. Force and dollars did not disappear because an eviction was stayed. And Diane was working the tenant assistance angle and the harassment petition, and the numbers were moving, but slowly, and the way legal numbers move. Still owed money to a man who had tried to threaten him into silence. And that fact sat in his chest like a stone that hadn't dissolved. Indigion, but there was also this. He was sitting in a lunch counter in Castillo with money in his pocket that he had earned this morning. That would be earned again on weekdays, and that would accumulate in the way that honest money accumulates when you show up and do the work right. It was not a solution. It was the beginning of one. And beginnings were what you worked with when solutions weren't yet available. He finished his sandwich and went back for the break job. 3 weeks later, Diane called with news. Ethan was at Iron Valley when his phone rang, elbow deep in a carburetor rebuild that Ray had assigned specifically because it was the first real repair his grandfather had ever let him complete alone. Stepped out of the bay and answered it. The harassment petition came through, Diane said. She had the controlled energy of someone delivering good news who doesn't want to oversell it. And the judge agreed that the pattern of contact, the 1115 voicemail, and the Pitts call, any the web contact, and the text constituted coordinated tenant harassment in direct response to a Protected Witness Act. HPG has been ordered to waive the outstanding arrears in full. Ethan stood very still. In all of it, he said. In all $4,000, Diane said. And gone. Your mother's account is current as of this morning. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was aware that his hand was holding the phone too tightly, and he loosened it deliberately. And what about Hale? He said. And the sheriff's investigation is ongoing. They can't tell you where that ends. But the civil matter is resolved in your favor, and that resolution is on record. A pause. And Victor Hale spent a significant amount of money trying to pressure a 17-year-old out of a truthful statement. He lost the statement. He lost the lease case. He lost his contractor to a warrant, and he now has a documented harassment against his company. And she paused again. And the math did not work out for him. No, Ethan said. It didn't. And your mother is very relieved, Diane said. And I just got off the phone with her. And she cried a little, which she'll probably deny. Ethan almost smiled. And she'll absolutely deny it. No, I like her very much. Diane's voice shifted slightly, still professional, but warmer. What you did, the way you held your account, the way you documented everything, the way you kept showing up, that's what made this case winnable. And most people in your position would have changed the statement. And you didn't. A pause. And your grandfather raised you right. And your mother did. And probably both. Stood outside the shop with the desert heat on his face and the smell of motor oil on his hands and something in his chest that was too large and too mixed to be simply called relief. Thank you, he said. Everything. Needy, call me if anything else comes from his direction, Diane said. Though I don't expect it will. He went back inside, picked up his tools, finished the carburetor. And he told Ray at the end of the day. Ray listened without interrupting, the way he did most things. Ethan finished. Ray was quiet for a moment. And good, he said. That's it? Ethan said. And what else should it be? Ray said. He was cleaning his hands on a cloth, the same end-of-day ritual Ethan had started recognizing. And you had something real to hold on to, and you held it. Any law did what it's supposed to do. And your family is safe. He looked up. And what were you expecting me to say? I don't know, Ethan said honestly. And something bigger. Big things don't need big words, Ray said. And Frank taught me that too. He hung the cloth on its hook. And same time Monday? Same time Monday, Ethan said. And Hawk called that evening like he'd been waiting for the day to complete itself. And Diane told me, he said, before Ethan could say anything. And she called you too. It's me informed on things I was involved in starting, Hawk said. He said it without a trace of self-congratulation. How do you feel? Ethan thought about how to answer that, honestly. He was sitting on the front step of the house on Mesquite Road, and the evening settling in around him, and his mother inside doing something in the kitchen that involved the good skillet, which meant it was a real dinner and not the careful rationing of the last several months. Like the ground stopped moving, he said. The first time since February. Hawk was quiet for a moment. That's the right feeling, he said. Keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd changed the statement, Ethan said. If I'd taken the offer. We would have been current on rent. Hale would have moved on. I'd have walked away with the thing I needed most and given up the thing I couldn't replace. In your name, Hawk said. Name, my grandfather's. He paused. Think about the version of me that said yes, and I don't know that person. And good, Hawk said simply. You don't get to know him. Ethan looked at the desert evening, the last of the sun going down in bands he still didn't have the right words for. Can I ask you something? Yeah, that first moment, in the parking lot, and I walked up and asked you, he paused. Did you actually think? Not the part where you decided to help. In the first second, Hawk was quiet long enough that Ethan thought he might not answer. And then I thought, this kid is either very brave or very desperate. A pause. And then you said you weren't looking for charity. You wanted to trade. And I thought, both. Both. Another pause. Desperate people mostly ask to be saved. And brave people offer something. And you offered something. That's why I said eat first. And you wanted to see if I'd take the order, Ethan said. Wanted to see if you understood that accepting help isn't the same as giving up your pride, Hawk said. Some people can't tell the difference. Turn down everything because they can't separate need from weakness. He paused. You pushed back once when I told you to eat. You said you wanted to work first. That was real. And that was character. But when I held the line, you sat down. Because you're smart enough to know when the hill isn't worth dying on. A pause. That's the difference between stubbornness and integrity. And Frank Carter's grandson had integrity. He could see it in about 30 seconds. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. And the rag helped, Hawk said, and there was something in his voice that was as close to lightness as Hawk's voice got. Nobody shows up to ask 90 Hell's Angels for work and brings a cleaning cloth that's older than they are unless they mean it. Ethan looked at the rag in his hands, which he'd taken out of his pocket without noticing, the way he always seemed to when he needed to think. "And my grandfather used it for 30 years, he said. No, Hawk said. Bear told me. A pause. Take care of yourself, Ethan. And keep working. And keep showing up. He will. And when you've got something real going at Ray's, when you're steady, I'm going to send some of our bikes his way for service. And not charity. He's good, and it's good business. And I'm telling you so you know." A pause. "And you brought Frank Carter back into my world this week. And that's worth something I don't have a number for." And the call ended. Ethan sat on the step with the rag in his hands, and the darkening sky in his hands, and in sky above him, and his mother's cooking coming through the screen door, and the weight in his chest was completely different from the weight that had lived there for 5 months. It had not disappeared. And there was still real work ahead. Real money still needed earning. His mother's health still needed watching. And school still needed finishing. And Ray's shop needed showing up to every day, with the same quality of attention that his grandfather had modeled across 30 years of Saturdays. And none of that was easy. None of it was done. But the weight had changed from the weight of falling to the weight of falling, of carrying something. And those felt completely different in the body. And 6 months later, a reporter from the Castillo County paper came to Iron Valley Motors. Not for Ethan specifically, she was doing a piece on small businesses and came for Ray, who had been operating for 20 years and was exactly the kind of story that fit the space between the larger news items. And she spoke to everyone in the shop the way reporters do when they're trying to get a texture of a place. And she ended up sitting with Ethan for 20 minutes while he finished a job. She asked him how he'd come to work there. He told her the condensed version. In the summer, in the parking lot. In the rag and the question and the meal he'd been ordered to eat before he could work. He left out the legal parts because those weren't resolved in a way he could publicly discuss. And he left out some of the darker nights because those belonged to him and his mother. But he told her the essential thing. She wrote it up. A sidebar, 4 paragraphs, the kind of small story that gets read on a Wednesday morning with coffee and then mostly forgotten. Except that it didn't get forgotten. And someone shared it. And then someone else shared it. In the end of the week, it had moved through the county and then through the state. And then with the particular velocity the stories about real things sometimes reach further. And the phone at Iron Valley rang more than usual for 2 weeks. And people called to ask about the boy with the rag. And people called to tell Ray they'd bring their vehicles to him specifically because of the story. And people called to say they'd had similar experiences at 17, and the story made them feel something they needed to feel. An old woman called from outside Albuquerque and asked if the Frank Carter mentioned was the same Frank Carter who had run Ridgeline Motors. And when Ethan said yes, and she said her husband had been a customer there for 20 years, and Frank had once stayed 2 hours past closing to fix their car before a long trip they couldn't afford to postpone. And she'd thought about him often over the years and was glad to know his people were still in the world and still doing good work. Ethan held the phone for a long time after that call ended. And Ray came by and looked at him. "And you all right?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "And someone just told me a story about my grandfather." And Ray leaned against the door frame. Good story. He stayed late to fix a couple's car before a trip they couldn't put off, Ethan said. In charge extra. Any bottle, Ray nodded, the nod of someone recognizing a pattern they've seen before. He did that kind of thing. Constantly, Ray said. He never talked about it. You just found out about it later from other people. He paused. And that's what a real reputation is. Not what you say about yourself, and what other people say when you're not in the room. Ethan thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. And the Hells Angels came to Iron Valley for the first time in November. Not all 98 of them, with Hawk in the front and Bear beside him and Danny in the back making a comment about something that had Bear shaking his head. Pulled into the lot and came in the way. That group of men came everywhere, filling the space naturally, without aggression, just presence. Annie Ray came out of his office, and Shinny shook Hawk's hand and said, and they figured you'd show up eventually. And heard good things, Hawk said. And you sent him, and Ray said, and nodding toward Ethan, who was standing at the edge of the bay. He sent himself, Hawk said. He just pointed at the door. And Ray looked at that for a moment and then nodded. Once, the nod of a man who understands a distinction and agrees that it matters. Ethan checked in the bikes. He did it the same way he'd done everything since that Saturday in July, from the beginning, working forward, starting where the grime goes unnoticed. And he watched him work and made a comment about the systematic approach. And Bear told Danny to be quiet, which Danny did for almost 3 minutes before making another comment. When Hawk's bike came up, Ethan found that the exhaust gasket he'd flagged in July had been replaced. The ghost bluing was gone. And the chrome was clean. And someone got to it, Ethan said. In our regular shop, Hawk said. After I told him what you found, he paused. They were embarrassed. And they shouldn't be, Ethan said. It was subtle. No, Hawk said. They should be a little embarrassed. Good for the quality of the work. Ethan almost smiled. He kept working. And Bear materialized at his shoulder. How's your mother? Better, Ethan said. And she started a part-time job last month. Exception work. And her specialist says the condition is stabilized and she can handle light hours. He paused. She's good. He nodded. Good. She asked me to say thank you, Ethan said. And she said it to me probably 40 times in the last 6 months. I think she needs to say it to you directly at some point. Tell her it goes to Frank Carter, Bear said simply. He built the thing that made this possible before any of us were involved. Ethan looked at the rag that was on the edge of the workbench where he always put it when he was working. Invisible, but out of the way. Part of the shop now, the same way it had been part of the garage. I'm going to tell her that, he said. And she'll understand it. And she raised you, Bear said. And she'll understand it completely. On a Tuesday in December, 6 months after everything had started, Ethan Carter turned 18. His mother made the dinner she made for birthdays. The one with the good skillet, the same one that had been coming through the screen door on the evening, everything resolved. Ray gave him the day off, which Ray said was a scheduling decision and not a gift, which fooled no one. He sent a message that was 3 words and a period, the most communicative form of warmth Hawk appeared to be capable of by text. Diane sent a card that said congratulations and had a handwritten note inside that said she looked forward to one day seeing the name Carter on a business of his own. After dinner, Ethan's mother sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd laid out the bills in February, and the same table where he'd told her about the parking lot, and the same table where she'd put her hands flat and said, "We don't fold on this." And she looked at him for a long moment. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want you to actually hear it, not just let it go by." "Okay," he said. "When your father left, I was terrified," she said. Not just about money, any about you. And about what it does to a 17-year-old boy when the adult who was supposed to model what a man looks like walks away without explanation." She folded her hands on the table. "I was afraid you'd take the wrong thing from it, and that you'd learn that when things get hard, leaving is an option." Ethan looked at her. "Come. And you didn't learn that," she said. "And Jean, you learned the opposite. And you walked toward the hard thing every single time. You walked into a parking lot full of bikers with a cleaning rag because walking away wasn't something you were capable of." And her voice was steady, and her eyes were bright, and Sandra Carter was not going to cry at this table on a Tuesday. In December, she had decided that, but it was a close decision. "You don't know if that came from your grandfather or from somewhere you built yourself. And it's yours now. And nobody can take it." Ethan looked at his mother's hands, folded the way they always were when she was being honest about something large. "And I was scared the whole time," he said. "No," she said. "I'm still scared a lot. About money. And about whether Ray's going to keep needing me when I finish school. And about what comes after." "You know that too," she said. "And then how is it?" He stopped and started again. "How is being scared and doing it anyway different from just being lucky that it worked out?" And Sandra unfolded her hands and set them flat on the table, the way she did when she was making a point she needed her hands to anchor. "Because luck is what you get when you didn't do anything to deserve it," she said. "And you made every decision right. And you told the truth when it cost you something. And you documented everything when it would have been easier to hope. And you went to Ray's because Bear told you there was a door you hadn't knocked on yet, and you knocked on it. And you showed up Saturday at 7:15. She looked at him steadily. "And that's not luck. That's character doing its job." He was quiet for a moment. And he said, "Grandpa would have said something like, 'Anybody can hold a rag. And what matters is what you're willing to wipe up.'" And digging, Sandra looked at him. And she laughed, a real one, surprised out of her by the accuracy of it, the exact cadence and dry understatement that had been Frank Carter's natural register for 30 years. "Absolutely would have said that," she said. And he sat at the kitchen table together for a long time after that, not talking very much, which was fine because not everything needed words. And the workbench in the shop in Castillo, a worn canvas bag sat beside a set of tools arranged in the order Frank Carter had always kept them. And the edge of the bench was a rag gray now, and he ground in with 6 months of honest work, thinner than it had started but holding together, in the way things hold together when they were made right to begin with. Ethan Carter had walked into a parking lot at 17 with nothing but that rag and the decision to offer something real instead of asking for something free. He had been fed. He had been seen. He had told the truth when the truth was expensive and held it when someone tried to buy it back. He had shaken the hand of a man who owed his education to his grandfather, and he had earned that handshake with the quality of his attention rather than the weight of the name. He had not been rescued, and he had been recognized. And that was the whole difference, because rescued meant someone else's strength had carried you. But recognized meant your own strength had been seen, and which was the thing his grandfather spent 30 years of Saturdays trying to build in a boy who didn't yet know he was going to need it. The rag was still in his pocket. It would always be in his pocket. In CTs, Kyon, some things you carry not because they're useful anymore, but because they're true, because they're the object that was in your hand at the moment you decided who you were going to be, and you keep them close so you never forget that the decision was yours, and the courage was yours, and whatever comes next is going to be built the same way, in one honest piece at a time, and with no shortcuts, and no borrowed credibility, and no apology for what you are. Ethan Carter was 18 years old, a mechanic's apprentice, a student, a son, and the grandson of a man whose reputation had traveled 30 years through time and arrived exactly when it was needed. And had asked for a sandwich and received something no one could ever take from him. He had earned every bit of it.